Hey Finxters, let's learn how to convert a string value to a float value in Python. In this lecture, I'll provide you three ways of converting a string value to a float value. But before we dive into those methods, let us try and understand what is type conversion in Python. In simple terms, the process of converting an object of a particular data type into another type is known as type conversion. For example, you have an object that is of integer type and now you want to convert that into a float object. So this process is known as type conversion. Now type conversion can be of two types. The first is implicit type conversion and the second is explicit type conversion. Now what is implicit type conversion? When Python automatically converts one data type to another data type without the involvement of the user or the programmer, then it is known as implicit type conversion. While the type of conversion in which the user has to explicitly convert an object of one type to an object of another type, it is known as explicit type conversion. Let us quickly go ahead and have a look at few examples to understand implicit and explicit type conversion. And then we shall dive into the methods that will help us to convert a string object to a float object. Okay, so let us go ahead and let's have a look at an implicit type conversion wherein Python will automatically convert one data type into another. Let's say we have integer data type or an integer variable which stores the value 50, while we have another variable y which stores a float value which is 5.5. Now let's go ahead and store the result of the multiplication of x and y in our variable res. Now you can see that we have couple of variables x and y and both of them are of different types. X is an integer data type while y is a floating data type or a floating point value. Now what happens when we multiply x into y? Let's visualize what happens and then I'll explain. Let's print the value stored in res. And now as you can see, the value is 275.0. That means res is a floating point value. In order to have a better understanding of this, let us go ahead and let's say y is 5.53. Now let's go ahead and let's execute our code. Now as you can see, the result is 276.5 and this makes it very clear that res is a floating point value. Thus, this means that Python will implicitly promote a lower data type to a higher data type. In this case, the lower data type was an integer, that is x, while y was the higher data type, which was a floating point value. Thus, when we multiplied both the values, the resultant value was a floating point value because Python automatically promoted the type of the resultant data type into a floating point value. But now let's see what happens if we go ahead and create another variable. Let's call it name. And now let's say that name is a string data type which stores the string Finxter. So now what happens if we go ahead and try to add x plus name? Here x is an integer data type while name is a string. So what do you think might happen in this case? Is string a higher data type or is integer an higher data type? Or is this operation even allowed? Let's go ahead and execute this code to understand this. And as you can see, we have a type error which says that the operand types are not supported. This means you cannot add an integer and a string value in Python. So how can we fix this? Let's say that the output that we want is Finxter 50. So we need an output which is a string. In order to do that, we have to explicitly convert x into a string type. And how do we do that? To do that, we use a built-in function in Python, str. So the str function will convert our integer object into a string object. In this case, the integer object is x, and now we are converting it or explicitly converting it to a string type. Thus, explicit type conversion is also known as type casting. Now, since we need the answer as Finxter 50, so let's rearrange the variables in our print statement. And now let's go ahead and execute our code to find if we have the desired output. And there we go. Exactly the output that we wanted. So now I hope you understood the difference between an implicit type conversion and a explicit type conversion. In the implicit type conversion, we didn't have to do anything. The lower data type was converted to a higher data type, while in the explicit type conversion, we had to explicitly convert the integer into a string, and then we could perform the operation that we wanted. Okay, that was it for implicit type conversion and explicit type conversion. Now let us dive into the topic of discussion. So as I mentioned, I will be discussing three methods that will help us to accomplish our goal. The first way is to use a built-in method in Python known as float. Float is a built-in method in Python that converts a value of a particular data type other than a floating point value to a floating point value. Now in this case, we have to convert a string value to a float value. So let's say we have a string 3.8. Now note that 3.8 is a string. It is not a floating point value since I have used the quotes. And now let's say we have a floating point value which is 10.25. So let's go ahead and find out what happens when we try to multiply both the values. This means S into F. Now let's print the output or execute the output, and as you can see, we have an error because this operation is not allowed between the two different data types. So what's the solution? We simply need to go ahead and convert our string value into a float value. So this means S, which is a string value, has to be first converted into a floating point value, and then you have to multiply it with 10.25. I can simply do that within the print statement itself. However, in order to understand things better, let us use another variable x, wherein I will be converting or typecasting s into a float value with the help of the float method. Now within the float method, you have to pass s as an argument. That is the object which you want to convert to a floating point value. Hence here s is the string which we want to convert to a floating point value. Now let's go ahead and instead of multiplying s into f, let's multiply x into f, and let's find out what happens when we execute our code. And now as you can see, we have the output that we expected. This was very easy. All we had to do was to explicitly typecast the variable s, which stored a string value, to a floating point value with the help of the built-in method in Python, float. That is, the name of the method is float. And within the float method, we passed s as an argument. A very important point to be noted in this case is that you can only convert a numeric string, that is a string only containing numbers, to a floating point value. If you try to typecast a text string to a float object, it will lead to a value error. Let's have a look. Let's say S was Finxter instead of being 3.8. Now Finxter is a text, simply a word. So let's go ahead and execute our code now and let's see what happens. And as you can see, as I mentioned, there's a value error because you cannot convert string to float in this case, as the string in this case was a simple text. So I hope you understood the difference between the first example wherein we used a numeric string and the second example wherein we used a string which simply consisted of a text. Okay, that brings us to the end of our first method. Now let's discuss another way of doing this. So let's say we have the same variables s and f, wherein s is a string while f is a floating point value. But now instead of using the float method, we will be using a function to convert the string to a float value. Now I will be explaining this to you with the help of couple of examples. In the first case, let us consider that we have only two numbers or two variables. So let's go ahead and quickly create our function. Let's name it convert. And now convert will have three arguments. The first two arguments will be s and f, and then the third argument will accept the float data type itself. Now let's move inside our function and let's go ahead and typecast our string object, which is s. So to do that, we simply have to use our third argument cast, which stores the data type float itself, and within it we simply have to pass the argument s, which is the string object. Now let's simply go ahead and print x, which is the string data type converted into a floating point value into our floating point value, which was already present previously. And now let's go ahead and simply call our function convert, and within it we have to pass s, which is the string value, f, which is the floating point value, and now we have to pass float as the third argument. So if you have a close look, you'll find that this method is simply a modification of the previous method. We are simply implementing the logic behind the built-in method float with the help of a user-defined function. That's all we are doing. Let's go ahead and execute this code to understand how this is working. And there we go. We have the expected output. Okay, now let's say we have more than three values. That is, let's say we have s1 as 3.8, while we have another string variable which is s2, and it stores the numeric string 4.5. And now how will we perform operations like multiplication or addition upon these three variables using the method that we just learned? To do this, we have to store all these values in a list and then pass that list to our function. So let's see how we can do that. Let's say we have a list li, and within li we are storing the values s1, s2, and f. So now this list has couple of string elements while the last element is a floating point value. Now let's go ahead and create our function. I'll name it convert underscore to, and now convert underscore to will accept only couple of arguments. The first argument will be the list itself, which stores all the variables within itself, while the second value or the second argument will be the float data type itself, as we did in the previous case. So this will help us to typecast our values in the list to floating point values. Now within this function, let's create a for loop in order to iterate over the list elements. So for I in li, and then let's create another variable x which stores the output such that x equals x plus I. And now remember, you have to typecast every element in the list to a floating point value. So you simply need to use your argument cast, which will help you to typecast the value of every element in the list to a floating point value. Also, we need to initialize x so that we do not come across an error. Okay, now let's come out of the loop and let's simply print x. Okay, we are done with our function, and now it's time to call our function. So the name of our function is convert underscore to, and within this we have to pass couple of values. The first value is list itself, while the second value will be the float data type. So you must note that when you are passing a second argument, then it has to be a float value. So you must note that second argument is the data type to which we want to typecast our string variable. For instance, if you wanted to convert the string to an integer object, in that case, instead of float, this should have been int, which is integer. But in this case, we are converting the string to a floating point value, so it will be float. That's it. Let's go ahead and execute our code. And there we go. As expected, we have the correct output. Okay. That brings us to our final method, wherein I will be introducing you to a method known as AsType. Now, the AsType method in Python works with the NumPy module and the Pandas module, and it is a method of these modules. So, in this case, we will convert a string object to a float object. And in order to understand this method, we definitely need a different example. But even before we use a different example, we have to import the NumPy library. Now, as I mentioned, that AsType is a part or a function of the NumPy library and the Pandas library. So we must import those libraries in order to work with AsType. Now, this is very useful when you are working with arrays that consist of string elements. So without further delay, let us go ahead and import the NumPy library. So I'll import it as NP. Now this is the abbreviation used for NumPy, NP. For pandas, it is PD. Since we are using an example with respect to the NumPy library, so I use the abbreviation NP. Now let's say we have a string array, and within this array, we have specific elements. And all of these elements will be strings or numeric strings to be more specific. So how do I create my NumPy array? To do that, I have to use the NumPy library, np dot, and then the array method of the NumPy library, within which we will specify the elements of the array. Let's consider that these are the three numeric strings of our array. Now, as you can clearly see that these elements are strings. For example, let me go ahead and use a print statement, and let's try and check the type of the first element in our array, which is 25.25. So the name of our array is string underscore array, and we are trying to test the type of the first element, which is 0, or which is at the 0th index. Now let's go ahead and execute this and find out what happens. The first element is of a string type. So how do we convert it into a floating point value? This is where the AsType method will help us to reach our goal. So let's say we have another variable which goes by the name float underscore array, and within this we will store our array by converting all the elements to floating point values. So to do this, we first need our array which stores the values as strings. So the name of that array is string underscore array dot, and then our function as type. And within this function, we have to mention the type to which we want to convert our string into. This means we want to convert our string into a floating point value that is of float type. So to do that, you simply need to pass np, which is our NumPy library, dot float underscore. So this will help you to tell Python that you want to convert your NumPy array, which had elements in the form of strings or numeric strings, to an array which consists of elements that are floating point values. Now let's go ahead and check what's the type of the first element of this array, that is the converted array. So we use our type function, and within it we pass float underscore array, and we want to access the first element and check its type. So we have to specify the index, which is 0. Now let's go ahead and execute our code and let's find out what happens. And now in this case, we see that the first value was a float value. To cross verify this, let us go ahead and type in a little piece of code to find out what happens when we add all the values in the array. Hence, let's initialize a variable sum which will store the output. Now let's iterate over our array using a for loop for I in float underscore array. Now let's simply add every element in the array which is stored within I in the for loop. Okay, this should be sum plus I. Now let's go ahead and simply print the value of sum. Okay, that's it. Now let's go ahead and execute our code to find out what happens. And as you can see, there we have the correct output. Let's also try and check the type of our variable sum. So we use the function type. Within it, we pass sum. Okay, now let's execute our code once again. And as you can see, sum is once again of the type float. So that's how the AsType function helps you to convert an array that consists of numeric strings to an array of floating point values. So that's it for this lecture. If you found this lecture to be helpful, please give it a like and please do not forget to subscribe our channel to get more interesting contents and tutorials. Okay, goodbye.